How are covenants often sealed in these moments? Somebody throw it out. Blood, right? Covenants are sealed in blood. So when we read covenant, we should read it as grace, as the grace of God. We're not just going around our lives with a duster. No, we need the blood of Christ. That's what the text reminds us. And so we don't need our sin managed. We need our sin forgiven. We need it forgotten. We need it cast away. And how does this happen? Well, Jesus tells us what his death means. His death means substitute. And so the way that our sins are forgiven and the way that our sin is forgotten is through God's grace by his blood, by the blood of his son Jesus. In fact, there's a striking connection with even the language that Jesus uses here, the blood of the covenant, to Isaiah chapter 53. If you want, you can go there. Isaiah 53, maybe really, if you haven't read that in a while, I'm sure most of you have read it, but if you haven't read it in a while, go back and read it. Our deepest single need, church family, our deepest single need is the forgiveness of sins. And the main block, the main wall between fellowship with God and fellowship with others is our sin. That's the main thing. Now, maybe you're thinking, well, maybe it's the sin of someone else. That may be very true. But the main block between fellowship with you and God or you and others is sin. And that has been dealt with. However, the scriptures are also instructive to us. They tell us as the people of God what obedience looks like. And so many times we kind of give our intellectual assent to the gospel, but we skip what Paul says in 1 Corinthians 11 that says, let him examine himself. So we ought to examine ourselves. We ought not just to rush up to the table. If you've examined yourself, you ought to rush up to the table, but as Paul instructs us, let one examine himself, and we'll get to that more in just a minute. But when Paul instructs us to do something, we heed what Paul says. And so later in 1 Corinthians 11, the church had fully adopted this practice of the Lord's Supper, and Paul instructs. And so let's go there to 1 Corinthians 11. Paul's writing here begins in verse 17. But look what he says in verse 23. This, by the way, this will kind of give us proper understanding for how to read the words of Paul.